The discovery. The walls of Windsor Castle have witnessed countless secrets throughout 8 centuries of British history, yet none perhaps as startling as what transpired on a cold November morning when security footage revealed a conversation never meant for public consumption. In the private drawing room where monarchs have contemplated matters of state since the reign of William the Conqueror, Queen Consort Camilla was captured speaking words that would send shockwaves through the very foundations of the monarchy. The recording emerged not through journalistic investigation or deliberate surveillance, but through an accident of modern security protocols. A recently installed camera system meant to enhance protection for the aging King Charles Roman III had been positioned to monitor entry points throughout the residential quarters. What it captured instead was a moment of unguarded candor that palace officials would later describe as catastrophic. Camilla stood near the window overlooking the East Terrace gardens, her silhouette framed against the pale morning light. She was not alone. With her stood 3 figures whose presence in such an intimate setting raised immediate questions among those who would later review the footage. Lady Susan Blackwood, a longtime confidant whose family ties to the aristocracy stretch back 4 generations. Sir Malcolm Petton, former private secretary to the late Queen Elizabeth and a man whose influence in palace corridors remains formidable despite his official retirement. And perhaps most surprisingly, Mark Thornton, a legal advisor whose specialty in constitutional law had made him indispensable during several recent royal crises. The conversation began innocuously enough with discussions of the king's upcoming state visit to France and concerns about his stamina for the demanding schedule. Charles had recently celebrated his 76th birthday, and his health, while publicly reported as stable, had become a source of private anxiety within the palace walls. He had assumed the throne at an age when most men consider retirement, and the weight of the crown had proven more burdensome than even his decades of preparation had anticipated. But then the tone shifted. Camilla's voice, usually measured and diplomatic in public settings, took on an edge of frustration that caught even the experienced ears of security personnel off guard. She spoke of decisions being made without consultation, of advisors being dismissed or sidelined, of a growing isolation around the king that troubled her deeply. The concern in her voice seemed genuine, maternal almost, as she described watching her husband struggle with the demands of kingship, while refusing to delegate authority to those who might ease his burden. Yet, it was what came next that transformed concern into something far more troubling. Lady Blackwood posed a question that hung in the air like smoke. What if the king were deemed unable to fulfill his duties? What if his health, already fragile, were to deteriorate to a point where constitutional questions could no longer be avoided? The words were spoken carefully, clinically almost, but their implication was unmistakable. Camilla's response would later be analyzed by constitutional experts, psychologists, and royal commentators with an intensity usually reserved for matters of war and peace. She did not reject the premise. Instead, she engaged with it, exploring scenarios that involved regency councils, temporary transfers of power, and the possibility of Prince William assuming responsibilities before his father's death made such a transition inevitable. She spoke of conversations with members of Parliament, of quiet soundings taken among senior royals, of legal opinions sought regarding the mechanisms by which a sovereign might be encouraged to step aside for the good of the realm. The camera captured every word, every gesture, every meaningful glance exchanged between the 4 conspirators, for that is what they appeared to be in that moment. Despite whatever noble intentions might have motivated their discussion, They were plotting a course that, however gently phrased, however wrapped in concern for the king's well-being, amounted to a palace coup executed not with soldiers, but with solicitors, not through violence, but through the subtle manipulation of constitutional precedent. Sir Malcolm spoke of historical parallels invoking the abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward Roman VIII chose love over duty. Though the circumstances bore little resemblance to the present situation, the comparison itself was telling, suggesting that departure from the throne, however achieved, might be framed as a choice made freely by a monarch acting in the nation's best interest. Mark Thornton outlined the legal framework that would support such a transition, citing precedents from earlier centuries when kings had effectively been removed from power while maintaining fiction of their sovereignty. Throughout this extraordinary conversation, Camilla remained the central figure, neither initiating the most controversial suggestions nor rejecting them. She listened, questioned, and ultimately seemed to give tacit approval to further exploration of options that just months into her husband's reign contemplated its premature conclusion. The woman, who had waited decades to become queen consort, now appeared to be considering how her husband might be persuaded to relinquish the crown he had inherited after a lifetime of preparation. The discovery of this footage created an immediate crisis within the small circle of senior palace officials with access to security recordings. Protocol dictated that such material should be routinely reviewed and archived, but the content of this particular recording made following standard procedures impossible. The individuals who first witnessed the conversation understood instantly that they held in their hands something with the potential to destroy the monarchy itself, or at minimum to tear apart the royal family at a moment when unity and stability were paramount, the king's burden. To understand how such a conversation could occur, one must first understand the weight that King Charles carried into his unexpected reign. He had been Prince of Wales for longer than any heir in British history, waiting 73 years to assume the throne he had been groomed for since childhood. His mother's extraordinary longevity, while a blessing to the nation, had created a peculiar challenge for her successor. Charles arrived at kingship not as a young man ready to shape his era, but as an elderly monarch whose best years of energy and vision lay behind him. The coronation in May of 2023 had been a magnificent affair, blending ancient ritual with modern sensibility in ways that reflected Charles's own complex relationship with tradition and progress. Yet even in that moment of triumph, observers noted the fatigue in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he held the orb and scepter, the way he leaned heavily on Camilla during the lengthy ceremony. The crown, both literal and metaphorical, weighed heavily from the very beginning. In the months following his accession, Charles had thrown himself into the role with determination that bordered on obsession. He maintained a schedule that would exhaust men half his age, rising before dawn to review state papers, attending multiple engagements each day, and traveling extensively throughout the United Kingdom and Commonwealth realms. He seemed driven by an acute awareness that his time as monarch would be limited, that he must accomplish in years what his mother had achieved across decades. But the human body recognizes limits that ambition often ignores. Charles had already survived several health scares during his years as Prince of Wales, including a bout with COVID that left him weakened for months. His fingers, swollen and painful from what doctors suspected was arthritis, made simple tasks like signing documents an ordeal. He tired easily, though he fought to hide it, and members of his household staff reported finding him asleep at his desk in the early evening. Official papers scattered around him, having succumbed to exhaustion mid-sentence, Camilla watched her husband's struggles with growing alarm. Their marriage, forged through scandal and sustained through decades of public criticism, had matured into a genuine partnership built on mutual support and understanding. She knew him as no one else did, understood the depths of his commitment to duty and his fear of failing to measure up to his mother's legacy. She saw how he pushed himself beyond reasonable limits driven by demons both internal and external. The queen consort's role, as she conceived it, was to protect her husband even from himself. She began to intercede with his private secretaries, suggesting schedule modifications, requesting that less critical engagements be delegated to other members of the royal family. Initially, Charles acquiesced to these changes, trusting her judgment and grateful for her advocacy. But as the modifications became more frequent and more significant, he began to resist. A particular incident in late summer had crystallized the growing tension between them. Charles had been scheduled to undertake a week-long tour of Scotland, visiting remote communities and highlighting environmental initiatives he had championed for decades. 2 days before departure, Camilla convinced his medical team to recommend postponement. Charles erupted in rare fury when informed of the cancellation, perceiving it as an attempt to manage him rather than support him. The argument that followed, conducted behind the closed doors of their private apartments at Balmoral, was overheard by staff members who later described it as the most heated exchange in their years of service. Charles accused Camilla of undermining his authority, treating him like an invalid rather than the sovereign. She countered that watching him slowly destroy himself through overwork, while refusing to acknowledge his limitations, was unbearable. Both perspectives held truth, and neither could find common ground. It was in the aftermath of this confrontation that Camilla began to confide in the small circle that would later appear in the fateful security recording. She spoke not of betrayal or ambition, but of genuine desperation. She loved a man who was killing himself through devotion to duty, and she could not stand by and watch it happen. The question she posed to her confidants was both simple and terrible. What options existed when the king's judgment about his own capacity could no longer be trusted? The British constitutional system, for all its evolution over centuries, provides remarkably few mechanisms for dealing with a monarch whose physical or mental capacity becomes compromised. Unlike the American system with its clear succession procedures and disability protocols, or parliamentary democracies where prime ministers can be removed through votes of no confidence, monarchy operates on the presumption of the sovereign's continuing fitness. George Roman III's madness in the early 19th century had necessitated a regency, but that situation involved clear incapacity. What Camilla faced was far more ambiguous: a king who was technically capable of performing his duties, but who was arguably damaging himself in the process. Sir Malcolm Petton, drawing on his decades of palace experience, explained to Camilla the delicate dance that would be required. Any suggestion that the king should step aside, even temporarily, would need to appear to originate from Charles himself. The fiction of royal autonomy had to be maintained even as others worked behind the scenes to engineer a particular outcome. It would require the coordination of medical advisors, constitutional experts, senior members of the royal family, and key figures in the government. Most critically, it would require Prince William's cooperation, for without the heir's willingness to assume greater responsibilities, any transition plan would collapse. Camilla listened to these explanations with a mixture of hope and horror. The path being described sounded uncomfortably close to conspiracy. Yet the alternative, watching Charles continue on his current trajectory until genuine collapse, made intervention unavoidable and seemed worse. She found herself in a position no queen consort in modern history had faced, forced to choose between loyalty to her husband's stated wishes and what she believed to be his genuine welfare. The conversations continued over several weeks, always in private, always with the same small group. Plans were sketched, contingencies considered, and potential obstacles identified. Yet, even as these discussions progressed, Camilla remained conflicted. She had not yet committed to any course of action, had not given final approval to approaches that would set irreversible processes in motion. She was exploring, considering, seeking counsel on a problem that seemed to have no good solutions. The palace awakens. The security footage sat in a locked safe for 72 hours before the chief of palace security, Commander James Whitfield, made the decision that would transform private conspiracy into public crisis. Whitfield, a former Scotland Yard detective who had spent 15 years protecting the royal family, understood that the recording represented a threat that could not be contained indefinitely. Too many people had access to the security systems. Too many opportunities existed for leaks, and the content was too explosive to remain secret forever. Whitfield's decision to brief the King's principal private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, proved to be the first domino in a cascade that would soon engulf the palace. Alderton, a diplomat by training and temperament, recognized immediately that he faced a crisis without precedent in his decades of royal service. The recording implicated the queen consort in what could be interpreted as plotting against the sovereign. Yet, it also revealed genuine concern for the king's well-being. How to respond to such a situation required wisdom that Alderton was not certain he possessed. The decision was made to brief the king himself before taking any further action. The alternative, attempting to manage the crisis without Charles's knowledge, seemed both impractical and disrespectful. Whatever else might be said about the situation, the king deserved to know that his wife and trusted advisors had been discussing his potential removal from the throne. However gently phrased the concerns might have been, the meeting took place in the king's private study at Buckingham Palace on a Thursday afternoon. Present were Commander Whitfield, Sir Clive Alderton, and the king's personal physician, Dr. Marcus Sheffield, who had been included on the assumption that a medical context might be needed. Charles sat behind the desk that had belonged to his mother. His expression neutral as Alderton explained that security footage had captured a conversation requiring his immediate attention. The recording was played without preamble. Charles watched his wife on the monitor, listened to her voice discussing his capacity, heard the careful legal language, exploring paths to his removal. His face remained impassive throughout, a lifetime of training in emotional control serving him in this moment of ultimate betrayal. When the recording ended, silence filled the room for what seemed an eternity. Charles's first question was not about the conspiracy itself, but about who else had seen the footage. When assured that the circle remained extremely limited, he nodded slowly. His second question revealed the depth of his pain. Did Camilla know that he was being shown this material? When told she did not, he considered this information carefully before speaking again. What followed was not the explosion of rage that those present had feared, but something more disturbing in its quiet intensity. Charles spoke of the loneliness of kingship, of how the crown created a barrier between the sovereign and every other human being, including those closest to him. He described the particular pain of discovering that even his wife, the person he trusted most completely, had been discussing his removal as though he were already incapacitated. The words came slowly, carefully chosen, heavy with an exhaustion that went beyond the merely physical. Yet even in his pain, Charles displayed the quality that had defined his long preparation for kingship, a capacity to see beyond his personal hurt to the larger implications for the institution he served. He asked about the legal mechanisms that had been discussed in the recording, wanting to understand whether the paths being explored actually existed within the constitutional framework. Dr. Sheffield provided context about the king's health, confirming that while challenges existed, nothing in his condition warranted considerations of incapacity. Alderton, demonstrating the diplomatic skill that had made him indispensable to the royal household, gently suggested that the queen consort's actions, however misguided, appeared to stem from genuine concern rather than personal ambition. Camilla stood to gain nothing from Charles's removal from the throne. Her position and influence derived entirely from her status as his wife. If anything, a regency or abdication might diminish her role rather than enhance it. This observation seemed to penetrate Charles's anger in a way that nothing else had. He sat in silence for several minutes, processing this perspective, reconsidering the motivations behind what he had witnessed. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from betrayed husband to analytical monarch. He wanted to know exactly who had been involved in the conversations, what specific proposals had been seriously discussed, and whether any actual steps had been taken toward implementing scenarios that had been contemplated. The answers provided some measure of relief. No approaches had yet been made to Prince William. No formal legal opinions had been commissioned, and no members of Parliament had been contacted beyond informal soundings. The conversations, however troubling, remained in the realm of theoretical exploration rather than active conspiracy. The difference mattered, though perhaps less than those present hoped it might. Charles made a decision that revealed both his political acumen and his enduring commitment to protecting the monarchy from scandal. The recording would be secured and access strictly limited. No investigation would be launched. No punishment meted out to those who appeared in the footage. Instead, the king would address the underlying issues directly through private conversations that would make clear his awareness of what had transpired and his determination to continue fulfilling his duties as sovereign. As for Camilla, Charles insisted on confronting her personally without witnesses or intermediaries. This was a matter between husband and wife, whatever their public roles might be. Alderton and the others were dismissed with instructions to ensure that security protocols were immediately strengthened to prevent any possibility of the recording being leaked or copied. Alone in his study, Charles sat with the weight of knowledge that could not be unlearned. His wife had discussed his removal with others before ever raising the subject with him directly. The woman he loved had, however noble her intentions, engaged in discussions that bordered on treason. The personal betrayal intertwined with the constitutional crisis in ways that made it impossible to separate private hurt from public duty. The confrontation evening descended on Clarence House, the London residence where Charles and Camilla maintained their primary home with an uncommon stillness. Staff members had been dismissed early, an unusual occurrence that sent ripples of speculation through the household. The king and queen consort would dine alone, a rare departure from the typically scheduled engagements that structured their lives. Camilla sensed something amiss the moment Charles entered the private dining room. His bearing, usually warm despite the formality required by his position, carried a coldness that made her immediately wary. They went through the motions of the meal in near silence, an excruciating pantomime of normally that fooled neither of them. When the plates had been cleared and they were finally truly alone, Charles produced a tablet computer and placed it on the table between them. He said nothing, simply pressed play on the security footage and watched her face as recognition dawned. Camilla's complexion went pale, her hand moving involuntarily to her throat in a gesture of distress that no amount of composure could disguise. The recording played through in its entirety while they sat across from each other, years of partnership hanging in the balance. When it ended, Camilla did not attempt immediate explanation or justification. She simply closed her eyes and waited for her husband to speak first. Charles's voice, when it came, was not the angry roar she might have expected, but something far more devastating, a quiet tone of profound disappointment. He asked her, when she had been planning to discuss these concerns with him directly, whether she had ever intended to include him in deliberations about his own capacity to serve as king. The questions were not rhetorical, but genuine, seeking understanding, even through betrayal. Camilla's response came slowly, each word carefully chosen. She spoke of watching him exhaust himself day after day, of seeing the physical toll that kingship was exacting, of her terror that he would collapse publicly in a way that would humiliate him and damage the monarchy. She described feeling helpless, trapped between her duty to support his wishes and her love for a man she believed was endangering his own health. The conversations captured on the recording, she insisted, were an attempt to explore options, not to engineer a coup. Charles listened without interrupting, a courtesy that Camilla recognized as both generous and ominous. When she finished, he asked a single question that cut to the heart of the matter. Did she believe him incapable of serving as king? The query demanded honesty, and Camilla, to her credit, provided it. She did not believe him currently incapable, but she feared he was on a trajectory that would lead to incapacity if changes were not made. What followed was a conversation that ranged across decades of their relationship, from their earliest days as young lovers through the scandal years, and into their eventual marriage and partnership. Charles spoke of feeling undermined at precisely the moment when he needed support most of how her actions, however well intentioned, had confirmed his deepest fears about being judged inadequate for the role he had waited a lifetime to assume. Camilla countered that his refusal to acknowledge his limitations was not strength but stubbornness. That true courage would involve delegating responsibilities he could no longer handle effectively. They circled each other verbally, each point of view containing elements of truth, neither able to fully convince the other. The turning point came when Charles revealed something he had not shared even with his closest advisors. He too had concerns about his capacity to fulfill the demanding role of monarch into advanced age. He too recognized that changes might eventually be necessary. What wounded him was not the substance of the concerns, but the method by which they had been addressed, the going behind his back rather than coming to him directly. This admission shifted the dynamic between them. Camilla had operated under the assumption that Charles was blind to his limitations, that he needed to be managed and protected from his own denial. Learning that he shared her concerns but resented her approach opened a path toward understanding that had not existed before. They talked through the night, long past the hour when they typically retired, working through layers of hurt and misunderstanding towards something resembling resolution. Charles made clear that any future discussions about his capacity would include him from the outset, that decisions about his reign would not be made without his participation. Camilla agreed, acknowledging that her exclusion of him from the deliberations had been both a tactical error and a personal betrayal. By dawn, they had reached an accommodation, if not quite a reconciliation. Charles would work with his medical team to develop a more sustainable schedule. one that preserved his ability to fulfill essential duties while acknowledging realistic limitations. Camilla would be included in these discussions, but would commit to raising concerns with him directly rather than through intermediaries. The individuals who had appeared in the recording with her would be quietly moved to other roles, their departure framed as routine reassignments rather than punishment. The agreement left much unresolved, particularly the question of what would happen if Charles's health genuinely deteriorated to a point where constitutional questions could not be avoided. They acknowledged this uncertainty, but chose to defer detailed planning until circumstances demanded it. The immediate crisis had been contained, though its effects on their relationship would resonate for the remainder of Charles's reign. The aftermath, the weeks following the confrontation, saw subtle but significant shifts in how the palace operated. King Charles's schedule, while still demanding, no longer pushed him to the point of visible exhaustion. Engagements were spaced more carefully, rest periods built into travel itineraries, and evening events reduced in frequency. To the public and press, these changes appeared unremarkable, simply the natural adjustment of a new monarch settling into his role. Behind the scenes, however, the reverberations of the security footage continued to shape palace dynamics in ways both obvious and subtle. The small group that had met with Camilla found themselves gradually but unmistakably sidelined from positions of influence. Lady Susan Blackwood announced her intention to spend more time at her country estate, a transparent euphemism for enforced retirement. Sir Malcolm Petton's invitations to palace functions became notably less frequent. Mark Thornon discovered that his legal services were suddenly in less demand as other solicitors appearing to handle matters that previously would have fallen under his purview. Prince William, when finally briefed on the incident by his father, reacted with a complexity that reflected his unique position. As heir to the throne, he stood to benefit from any arrangement that brought him closer to sovereign power. Yet, as a son, he was appalled by the suggestion that his father might be manipulated into stepping aside. His relationship with Camilla, never entirely comfortable despite years of public rapprochement, acquired a new weariness. She had crossed a line that could not be entirely uncrossed, even with understanding and forgiveness. The security recording itself became one of the most closely guarded secrets in palace history. Commander Whitfield personally oversaw the destruction of all copies save one, which was secured in a location known only to himself, Sir Clive Alderton, and the King. The camera system that had captured the conversation was reconfigured to ensure that private discussions in residential areas could no longer be inadvertently recorded. The few individuals who had viewed the footage understood without being told that their continued service to the crown depended on absolute discretion. Camilla herself underwent a transformation that observers noted without fully understanding. She became more circumspect in her public role, more careful about the boundaries between support and overreach. Her concern for Charles's well-being remained evident, but she channeled it through official channels rather than private conspiracies. The experience had taught her painful lessons about the limits of even a queen consort's influence and the dangers of attempting to protect someone from themselves. For Charles, the incident catalyzed a reckoning with truths he had previously avoided. He began meeting regularly with Dr. Sheffield, not merely for routine checkups, but for honest conversations about the intersection of his health and his duties. He consulted with constitutional experts about the mechanisms that would need to be invoked, should he genuinely become unable to serve. These discussions, conducted with his full knowledge and participation, felt entirely different from the plotting he had witnessed in the security footage. The king also made a surprising decision that demonstrated his political sophistication. He invited Prince William to participate more actively in state duties, gradually preparing his heir for eventual assumption of the crown in ways that had not occurred during his own long apprenticeship. This delegation came not from weakness but from strength, a conscious choice by a monarch secure enough to share rather than hoard power. It had the additional benefit of rendering moot the scenarios that Camilla and her associates had discussed. If William was already heavily involved in royal duties, the need for intervention diminished accordingly. The relationship between Charles and Camilla slowly healed. Though the wound left scar tissue that never entirely disappeared, they remained partners and spouses, but an innocence had been lost, a trust complicated, if not quite broken. Charles would occasionally reference the incident obliquely, usually during disagreements about his schedule, reminding her that he was cognizant of his limitations without needing to be managed. Camilla would accept these gentle rebukes, understanding that she had forfeited the benefit of the doubt that comes with uncomplicated trust. Parliament and the government remained entirely unaware of how close the monarchy had come to internal crisis. The Prime Minister, briefed in only the most general terms about adjustments to the king's schedule, accepted the explanations provided without probing deeper. The British press, usually voracious for royal scandals, missed the story entirely. The security footage that might have generated months of front-page coverage remained locked away, known only to a handful of individuals whose loyalty to the institution superseded any journalistic or personal interest in disclosure. As months passed and then a year, the incident began to acquire the quality of a nightmare remembered upon waking, vivid in the moment, but fading into uncertainty with time. Those involved sometimes wondered if they had overreacted, if the conversation had been as explosive as it seemed in retrospect, but then they would recall specific phrases from the recording. The clinical discussion of removing a king from his throne, and they knew that their response had been proportional to the genuine danger the situation represented. The monarchy survived this hidden crisis as it had survived countless others across centuries through a combination of discretion, pragmatism, and the willingness of individuals to place institutional preservation above personal interest. The price of survival, as always, was paid in private pain, in relationships complicated, in innocence lost. Charles and Camilla bore these costs together, bound by shared experience, even as that experience had wounded them both. In the end, the security footage represented both the fragility and resilience of modern monarchy. It revealed how quickly the entire edifice could be threatened by private conversations, yet also demonstrated the capacity of the institution to absorb shocks that would destroy less flexible systems. The British crown had bent but not broken, had faced crisis without collapsing, and had processed betrayal without destroying those involved. What remains hidden in palace vaults shapes the crown as much as what stands revealed in public ceremony. The true story of monarchy unfolds in conversations never meant to be overheard, in loyalties tested by impossible choices, in the eternal tension between person and institution. Subscribe to witness the unfolding drama as history writes itself in real time.